A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He replied to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over the wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him onto up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, "Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back." Which of these three, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
For tonight's Lenten evening prayer, we dive into the Gospel of Luke and we hear a little bit about the parable of the Good Samaritan. For lack of better words, two things really do stand out to me in this parable. One of them being, you may have heard one of the Ten Commandments, and which is to love your neighbor, in addition to loving God with all your being, all your strength, and as much as yourself. The second thing being, as witty and smart as the scholar of the law has shown in the reading, he asked Jesus to define what exactly is a neighbor. Jesus then goes on to say and explain the parable of the Good Samaritan by describing a neighbor as someone who may be in need or someone who can't defend themselves or who may seem helpless, who may need a little extra help, kindness, mercy, compassion, and love. Over the past year, as all of us, if not many of us, have experienced the effects of the global pandemic, COVID-19, and being in quarantine. However, I myself, being Filipino, Filipino American, Asian, Pacific Islander, Aside from the pandemic, there's one other issue that I myself had to worry about over the past year, and that issue is the unfortunate increase of racism and hate towards Asians in the Asian community. Many are believed to think that this hatred and increase in racism started because Asians are to blame for starting the coronavirus and thus bringing it here to not only America, but also other parts of the world. And at first, when the coronavirus came to the US and this belief and thought was in place, there were a lot of attacks on Asians that were primarily verbal, a lot of screaming, yelling of racial slurs, many videos going viral, popping up on many different websites and all over social media of these Asian individuals getting attacked for something that may not have been in their control. Unfortunately, since then, now that we're a little over a year now being in this global pandemic, the attacks have gone from verbal and explicit to very physical and violent over the past few months or so. And it's very, very unfortunate to see. There's one case in New York, a Filipino man in his 60s was going about his day, minding his business, riding the subway, when suddenly he was slashed across his face, leaving him with a large gash across his face and facial injuries. An even more unfortunate case in San Francisco, an 84-year-old Thai man was out and about on a walk in broad daylight when he was suddenly pushed over and attacked, unfortunately hitting his head on the concrete and dying a couple days later from his injuries. Hearing about these attacks, not only over the past couple months, but really over the past year since the coronavirus started, of course, gives myself a little extra something to worry about. But not only that, it gives me something more to worry about because not only being, of course, Asian myself, but, you know, having someone like my dad and fearing that something may happen with him. As many of you know, my late mother, she passed away almost 5 years ago due to health complications. And ever since then, it's been my dad and I. You can say that we do our best to take care of each other. However, whenever I hear about these attacks happening on Asians in the Asian community, I can't help but think of my dad and the fact that something could happen to him when he's just out and about minding his business. He could be out running errands, grabbing some groceries, or going out on a walk in our neighborhood, in our community. Or he could be here at the church doing his job for groundskeeping and maintenance. And unfortunately, I can't always be with him to take care of him as much as he takes care of me. And therefore, I say that it doesn't matter if you are white, black, Latino, Asian, heterosexual, homosexual, disabled, able bodied. If you can imagine having a loved one, and I'm sure we all have loved ones in some way, shape, or form, if you can imagine them, for whatever reason, minding their own business throughout their days, but then being attacked for simply being themselves, despite where they're from, how they speak, how they act and behave like, wouldn't that scare you too? I think what's important is to go back to what Luke talked about in the Good Samaritan, and that is to love your neighbor. As I mentioned before, your neighbor can really be anyone, not just the person physically living next door to you or across the street. But really, your neighbor can be simply someone you come across who cannot necessarily fend for themselves or help themselves, but may need a little help, mercy, compassion, kindness, and love. I don't have all the answers with the issue of how to deal with the racism and hatred in the Asian community. But what I do have is a voice to shine light on the issue, not just to speak about it, but to also encourage others to take a dive and help your neighbors in the Asian community as well, or any other neighbor who may need help. With that being said, I just want to leave this reflection with a thought. You may have heard the acronym WWJD. And no, that does not stand for www.jdduran.com, but it stands for, as many of us know, what would Jesus do? If Jesus were to encounter someone who needs help, kindness, compassion, and mercy, what would Jesus do? To rephrase that, what would you yourself do in that situation? Will you, as in the reading, walk on the opposite side while turning the other cheek, pretending as if you don't see or hear anything? Or will you really take the time to be a good Samaritan yourself and to shine light on someone who may need a little bit more kindness, mercy, compassion, and love as Christ's followers in the same way that Christ has instructed us to do so?